Is Graham Speak here? He is? Yes. Right, because I'm going to begin with the story about him. Friends, 2 nights ago, I had a dream. Graham and I were going together to the Holy Mountain, and he had quite a large suitcase with him. We arrived at the port of Daphne, and the customs officials forced him to open his suitcase, and it contained 17 pairs of shoes. The customs officials obliged him to pay duty on all these shoes. He was much offended by this. Afterwards, in my dream, I asked him, "Why have you brought all these shoes to the Holy Mountain?" And he replied, "I expect to do a lot of walking." So the dream ended. A lot of walking. That is precisely what I myself have done on the Holy Mountain in the last 54 years, since I first visited Athos. How many times have I been there? I've lost count. Almost as many times as the pairs of shoes that Graham had in his suitcase. And every time I go to Athos, I am accompanied by a little red notebook, which I have here, and I started in 1961 writing my notes on Mount Athos, and I've continued ever since. And I derive great pleasure looking back and reading about what I did in the past. In those 54 years, what changes have I seen on the Holy Mountain? And what have I learnt about the inner meaning and the spiritual significance of Athos? What have I come to see as its contribution to the wider community of the outside world, in the church as a whole, and indeed beyond the boundaries of the church? How does the Athonite monk serve and help others? Let me start with the physical reality of Athos. It is not just a mountain of holy monks. It is not just a mountain of holy monasteries and shrines. It is in itself a holy mountain, a point of light in sacred space, a sacrament of God's presence with humankind, a burning glass, concentrating the rays of the spiritual sun with an especial intensity. Indeed, a theophany. For me, Athos means all those things. The occasion when I felt this luminous quality of the mountain itself with particular vividness was when I went up to the summit, little short of 7,000 feet, by night, alone, in the 1970s. That was my second ascent. The first ascent I had made with Gerald Palmer as my companion, and we went by day. It's a good idea, if you're climbing a mountain, to go up for the first time with somebody who has been up before. On this occasion, I wanted to go up to the mountain in order to arrive at the summit at dawn and to watch the sunrise. So, around sunset, I set out from St. Anne's. Just before I was going to set out, there was a sudden, sharp fall of rain. And I said to the monk with whom I was staying, perhaps I ought not to go. And he said, and I'm very glad he said this, do go. You may never have another opportunity to climb to the summit. If you go, you will never forget it. And so I took his advice. Fortunately, there was no more rain. And it's true, I've never forgotten that journey to the top. I set off under good auspices. St. Anna's is, as you will know, a series of monastic cottages, a monastic village. And each cottage has perhaps between 2 and 6 monks, and each cottage has its own cistern with water for nurturing the garden. And each cistern has its own community of frogs. And on that night, I remember the frogs were in good voice. St. Anna's has the best human singers on the Holy Mountain, but it also has the best frogs as cantors as well. First you hear, far above you, some frogs striking up. Then another choir strikes up below, and then on the left and on the right, on every side, the frogs are singing. And the singing of frogs, to me, has a quite extraordinary beauty. I'm sorry to say that St. Gregory of Nyssa, in the Life of Moses, speaks disrespectfully of frogs. This is one of the few points where I venture to disagree with him. There is a pleasing story about frogs told on the Holy Mountain, rather typical of a monastic sense of humor. One time in the early morning, the frogs were making a great noise, and in one of the little hermitages, the superior went out from the chapel where they were having the divine office together, and he said, frogs, we've just finished the midnight office, we're just starting matins, would you mind keeping quiet until we've finished? And the frogs replied, we've just finished matins, and we're starting on the first hour. Would you like to keep quiet till we've finished? Now, I had chosen a day, or night rather, when there was a full moon. I thought that will guide my steps. I overlooked 2 points here. The first is that part of the path up the mountain from St. Anna runs through thick woods, and the moonlight didn't help me very much there. And the second thing that I had not anticipated is that moonlight has the effect of flattening the landscape, so that quite familiar scenes look different. Well, I set off. In the woods, I stumbled along in the darkness. I was astonished that there was a great deal of crashing and banging in the woods. I thought to myself, who is out in the woods at this hour of the night making such a noise? As I continued, emerging into a wilderness of boulders, looking for the chapel of the Mother of God that is about 1,500 feet below the summit where I planned to rest, I lost my way completely in the deceptive moonlight. I remember saying, don't panic, don't start rushing about, sit down quietly for a time. That I did. And then I rose to my feet, and immediately I saw, just a few hundred yards away, the very place I was looking for, the chapel. I reached the summit, having rested, just as the sun broke through the clouds to the east. I stood for a time watching the rising sun as the light turned from red to gold. Then I looked to the north, and from the summit of the mountain, I saw the whole of the Athonite Peninsula spread out before me as in a relief map. There is, in fact, a sheer cliff on the north side of the mountain, about 3,000 feet. And I looked over the top of that, down on the woods below, and the different monasteries. I could see all the paths. I could see exactly where on the previous days I had lost my way and taken the wrong turning. That's quite easy to do on the mountain. I remember one occasion on the mountain when I'd entirely lost my way, and ahead of me I was cheered to see a signpost. It was a crossroads, signpost with 4 fingers pointing in different directions. Aha, I thought, now I shall discover where I am. Not a bit of it. When I reached the signpost, I found that none of the 4 fingers had anything written on them at all. An apophatic signpost. Having gazed to the north, I then turned westwards with my back to the rising sun. And I saw a sight that I had never expected and that I will always remember. Across the sea, extending many miles, there was a pyramid of darkness, the shadow of the holy mountain. I've never, in any other part of the world, seen a sight like that, where the rising sun casts a shadow of the mountain over the seas. The shadow was shrinking perceptibly, moment by moment, as the sun rose higher. As I stood alone in this way on the summit, in the sunrise, it was very cold, though it was summer, beside the half-ruined chapel dedicated to the Transfiguration, I was given some inkling of the significance of the holy mountain as a holy place, as a focal point within sacred space. At that moment, at the summit, in the sunrise, I felt indeed Athos is a thin place. The wall between this visible world and the world invisible becomes so thin sometimes on Athos as to be almost transparent. So to me, that ascent of the mountain expresses much of what the Holy Mountain means in my heart. Now, perhaps you have been wondering, what was the banging and crashing that I heard in the woods? What was the cause? Was it the demons? Possibly. But more probably, it was caused by mules that had escaped from the monasteries and had gone wild. There are plenty of those wandering round the mountain. But they'll do you no harm. That leads me to reflect that Athos is not only a place of great natural beauty in its physical dimensions, it is also filled with living creatures. It's not just a mountain of monks, it is an animal sanctuary on a vast scale. I've spoken already of the frogs. Let's think of some of the other inhabitants of the mountain. Wolves. They are often mentioned in the books. In the recent decades, we have heard mixed reports. Sometimes it is said there are no more wolves. They've all been shot, not by the monks, but by the laymen who work on the timber in the mountain. But at other times, people say, well, no, there are still some wolves around. I've never seen any, but I suspect that sometimes on my solitary walks, I have been watched by the wolves. I remember one occasion I was staying at Quilandar, working with Gerald Palmer and Philip Sherrard on the translation of the Philokalia. On Sunday, we did not do any translation work together, and so after the liturgy and breakfast, Philip and I set off, going up to the ridgeway from Quilandar, walking along the ridgeway to the north towards the frontier, a 3.5-hour walk. And as I was taught to do as a child, I told the porter as I was leaving the monastery where we were going. "Ah," he said, "that part of the mountain, there are plenty of wolves." I thought no more of that, walked with Philip as far as the former Russian hospital at Kromitsa, just at the point where the road descends steeply towards Uranopolis. And then we parted company. He said, "I'm going down to the seashore to have a bathe." I said I would like to walk back along the ridgeway and enjoy the views. So I did. When you are walking alone with no companion, you become a little more nervous. The path was over sandy ground, and I noted, looking at the sandy ground, what I had not seen earlier on the walk were various footmarks, padded feet. I thought, oh, well, that would be dogs. Then I thought, no, it's rather large dogs. And so increasingly I began to think, yes, perhaps this is traces of the wolves. But I got home safely, I'm glad to say. Another animal with which I made friends when I was staying at Quilandar was a large snake, about 10 feet long. I sometimes went out for a walk in the midday when others were taking their siesta, and down a path just outside the monastery with walls of stone on either side, I would find a large snake enjoying the sun. And the first time I stopped, and he sat there looking at me. I clapped my hands, and he took no notice. I banged with my stick on the ground. He took no notice. So then I said to him, "Would you please mind moving aside? I want to go down this path." And he replied, "Since you've spoken to me politely, I will do so." And so he disappeared into the wall. But immediately I'd gone past, I heard whoosh, and out he came again to continue his sunbathing. The second day, I didn't have to ask him. I just banged with my stick and he moved aside. The third day, he didn't even wait for me to bang with my stick. We'd worked with a modus vivendi and he moved out immediately. So it is possible to have quite close understanding with characters whom you may not find immediately attractive. Another time, walking on the hills of Athos in a deserted area, I heard a strange sound, and I turned aside to see what it was. There was a small lake, and a rabbit had come down to drink from the lake, and a water snake had emerged, and it had the rabbit's head in its jaws, and it was gradually swallowing the rabbit, and the rabbit was screaming. I wondered whether I should intervene. I decided, no, this is not my business. But I did take note of the fact that I would probably be well advised not to take a bathe in that particular lake. The monks don't eat meat, but there are others on the holy mountain who do. Any visitor to Athos, sensitive to the natural world, will also be conscious of the birds on Athos. They make a great deal of noise. A friend of mine was once walking with a monk through the woods, and my friend has the ability, you may think it's a rather charming gift, of imitating birdsong. So the birds reply. He would go, "Bulululu," and the birds would then reply, "Bulululu." The monk was not at all pleased by this. With considerable disapproval, he said, "Would you mind not doing that?" "All right," said my friend, "but what's wrong?" And the monk replied, "You are disturbing the natural order." So this is the first thing that Athos has taught me, to appreciate the world as sacrament, to understand a little the intrinsic sanctity of the creation. Now another feature of Athos: creative silence. When I ascended and descended to and from the summit, in the course, I suppose, of some 8 hours or more, I did not meet another human person. And the same when Philip Sherard and I went from Quilandar up towards the frontier, and when I returned back on my own, a walk of 7 hours, I met no one. It would be difficult, perhaps, in the British Isles to go for a 7-hour walk and not to meet anybody else. But you can do that on the mountain. And this is a fundamental gift of Athos, the gift of silence, stillness, hesychia. Silence understood not in a negative sense as an absence of sound, but positively as an attitude of listening, as an awareness of the divine presence, as a waiting upon the Holy Spirit. So here then is the second thing that Athos has taught me, to appreciate the value of silence. Let me read to you some words of a pilgrim who went every year to the Holy Mountain, English Orthodox layman, my friend Gerald Palmer. It was midday on the 6th of August 1968. The motorboat from Daphne stopped at the harbour of Simonopetra. No one else landed, so after a friendly greeting from the monk on the jetty, I started climbing alone up the steep path as the motorboat went down the coast. After some 20 minutes or so, I reached the point where the path from the monastery of Grigoriou joins the track from the right. Here at the junction, there is a small shrine with a cross and stone seats under the shade of a roof. The open sides of the little building give wide views over the sea to the next peninsula. Having reverenced the cross, I sat down in the shade and looked out across the sea, listening to the silence. All was still. Immediately, I felt that now at last I was back on the holy mountain and thanked God for once again giving me this immense privilege. All was still. This stillness, this silence is everywhere, pervades all, is the very essence of the holy mountain. The distant sound of a motorboat serves only to punctuate the intensity of the quiet. The lizard's sudden rustling among the dry leaves, a frog plopping into a fountain, are loud and startling sounds, but merely emphasize the immense stillness. Often as one walks over the great stretches of wild country which form much of the sacred ground, following paths where every stone breathes prayers, it is impossible to hear a sound of any kind. Even in the monastery churches, where the silence is, as it were, made more profound by the darkness, by the beauty and the sacred quality of the place, it seems that the reading and chanting of priests and monks in the endless rhythm of their daily and nightly ritual is no more than a thin fringe of a limitless ocean of silence. But this silence, this stillness, is far more than a mere absence of sound. It has a positive quality, a quality of fullness, of plenitude, of the eternal peace, which is there reflected in the veil of the Mother of God, enshrouding and protecting her holy mountain, offering inner silence, peace of heart to those who dwell there and to those who come with openness of heart to seek this blessing. May many be blessed to guard here this peace and to bear it away as a lasting gift of grace. The phrase that Gerald uses, "every stone breathes prayers," was a characteristic phrase of a Russian starets on the mountain, Father Nikon, who lived in Karulia on the precipitous slopes in the far south of the mountain, and who died in 1963. I can remember going to meet him on my first visit in 1961. For the first hour, we talked in English. Then he said, "We have talked enough English. We will now continue in French." Well, I could manage that. And then at the end of the second hour, he said, "Please forgive me. Since I had a stroke, I have forgotten my German and Italian." I thought, just as well. But Gerald Palmer's account raises a question. Does today's pilgrim find on the Holy Mountain the silence that Gerald found in 1968? We have to allow for the fact that in the last 50 years there has been a huge increase in the number of visitors. In 1961, I stayed for 8 or 9 days in the Great Lavra, and the next year, 1962, for another 8 days. This was in September. And for almost all of that period, with the exception of 1 or 2 days, I was the only visitor in the Great Lavra. Today, hundreds pass through each day. And the great number of visitors, many of them Greeks rather than foreigners, in principle pilgrims rather than tourists, the great number naturally creates a sense of restlessness. You do not find the quiet and stillness that Gerald and I found half a century ago. The stillness of Athos is being eroded by vehicles, by mechanical instruments like chainsaws in the forest. It needs to be defended with vigilance. Now, I've been reflecting on the intrinsic holiness of the natural environment of Athos and on the quality of stillness, the creative silence which that environment embodies and expresses. Let's now turn to the human inhabitants of the mountain, the monks. Gerald has already made a reference there describing how in the liturgical worship of the monasteries, silence and sound, stillness and singing are intertwined and reinforce each other. What then did I find in 1961? I am glad that I visited the mountain in what may be called the pre-industrial era. There were no roads leading from one monastery to another at that time. Scarcely any vehicles. The Russian monastery had a road leading down from the woods on the hillside to the monastery, and they had a lorry to transport logs. I was told that Kilanda also had a tractor given by Tito, but I didn't see that. Otherwise, if you wanted to go round the mountain, you had to go on foot along the old mule paths, or you could hire a mule if you had money, but I was a poor student and couldn't do that. Or you could take one of the little motorboats that went round along the coast. But there were as yet no roads leading, vehicle roads, from one monastery to another. Though in 1962 I found that they were constructing a road up from Daphne to Carriers. This was in preparation for the Millennium celebrations in 1963. It was felt that the important people coming to the mountain could not be expected to ride on mules or to walk. The thin end of the wedge. The monasteries themselves were without electricity, except for Vatopedi, which had installed electricity in the 1920s or 30s, as well as adopting the new calendar for a time. But the electricity hadn't worked since the Second World War. There was no running hot water. If you wanted some hot water, you had to brew it up in a cauldron on a Primus stove. And certainly there was no central heating. You had cold water, you had oil lamps. The monks at that time were, for the most part, elderly. When you went round the monasteries, it was an exception to see a black beard. The numbers had been steadily diminishing since the First World War. In 1903, there were 7,432 monks on the mountain. Over half of them were non-Greeks. In 1913, 10 years later, the numbers had fallen by 1,000. There were 6,345. That was largely because of the troubles in the Russian monasteries concerning devotion to the name of Jesus. The dispute of the Imetslavtsi, and large numbers of Russian monks were forcibly expelled from the mountain in a rather scandalous way. In 1943, numbers had gone down to 2,878. 1959, 1,641. And in 1971, the low point, 1,145. Still quite a large number, but a small fraction of what had been there before the First World War. And the numbers were diminishing on the whole by about 40 or 50 every year. And almost all the monks were over 60 in age. But then a change came. 1972, for the first time since 1914, the numbers, instead of going down, went up by precisely one monk, 1,146. And since then, the numbers have continued to increase. I'm not sure, some of you may know better than I, but I think on the mountain today there are about 2,000 monks. And whereas in the 1960s when I went there, they were nearly all old. Today there is a much more balanced distribution of age. Indeed, in some monasteries, so far from not seeing a black beard, today you hardly ever see a white beard. They're all quite young. In 1961, many of the monastic buildings were in grave disrepair. The monks were just struggling to keep things going. I remember the elder at Philotheu, which was at that time idiorhythmic, saying, "Soon we on Athos will be just like the monasteries in Egypt, just ruins." Actually, since that time, there's been a notable revival of Coptic monasticism also. In 1961, virtually none of the monks would have university degrees. Most of them would have come from villages, probably aged about 15 or 16, without any higher education, with a simple village peasant background. Holy Communion was relatively infrequent. The monks used to go usually for communion 10 times a year. I can remember on my first visit in 61 being in the Great Lavra for the feast of the Nativity of the Mother of God, 8/21 September. There was a vigil service attended by about 80 monks, 40 laymen. At the high point in the vigil, the reading of the Gospel, there were about 8 priests and several deacons. Then, at the end of this vigil, a strange anticlimax. The liturgy was celebrated by one priest and no deacon. Though there were all these other priests and deacons there, they didn't take part. And when the moment for communion came, not one single person out of the 80 monks and 40 laymen came up to receive the sacrament. I left that vigil with a feeling of strange anticlimax. That would never happen today in any of the monasteries. And it's interesting that a leading Athonite writer, St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, in the early 19th century, was an active proponent of frequent communion. Synekis metalipsis, he called it, continual communion. But I would not wish to underestimate the character of the monks in that earlier era in the 1960s. They had a humble simplicity, a direct, vivid faith in the immediate presence of God that moved me profoundly. What about the situation today? Many younger monks, as I've said, much restoration of the buildings, not always wisely done. A glaring example from some years ago is the monastery of Dionysiou, which used to be surrounded by wooden galleries, very picturesque. And they decided to restore the monastery and to destroy these wooden galleries. And one side of the monastery, the wooden galleries were all taken away, and the side of the building was merely covered with concrete painted yellow. Fortunately, somebody realized what was going on, appealed to the authorities in the archaeological department, and this act of destruction was stopped. But often the monks have not been wise in their restoration work. Nowadays, in most of the monasteries, you will find electricity and hot water. Is this a betrayal of the ascetic tradition? I don't think so. When the monks had no running hot water, boiling up cauldrons on primus stoves, using oil lamps in the 18th, 19th century, that was the way people lived in the outside world. The monks were not being deliberately archaic, they merely lived as others did. Today, now that we do have electricity and running water and central heating, why should the monks remain fixed in a manner of heating water, of washing, and of lighting that is totally out of date? I don't think there's any intrinsic sanctity about primus stoves or oil lamps. I remember at Patmos when I was a deacon, the rule was that if we were going to serve the liturgy on Sunday, then on Saturday night, we must wash ourselves from top to toe, and we must wash our hair. Quite an exploit for the monks that had very long hair, which I didn't. And in my cell, I would boil up water, because I just had a tap with cold water. I would wash myself by degrees, because it was very cold. I had no heating. I didn't want to catch a chill. I had to wrestle with uncooperative primus stoves to heat the water up. So the total exploit of getting washed took about an hour. If I'd had a shower, a hot shower, I could have done that in 5 minutes. Is there any particular sanctity gained? Perhaps there is, but I doubt it. Why should we not, in the monastic life, make a moderate and reasonable use of the facilities that exist today? In the time since 1961, yes, there has been great improvement in the singing in the monasteries, in the food, in the plumbing. The monks are often well educated today, completed university degrees, DPhils, before they come to the monastery. And the monks are producing spiritual works of genuine value. There is frequent communion. But perhaps there's been a certain loss of the humble simplicity of which I spoke. But I do not doubt the fervour and commitment of the younger monks who come now to the mountain. But there is unfortunately a loss of stillness, much coming and going, vehicles all the time plying about the mountain on different roads, all the detritus of mechanical vehicles, barrels of tar left to rot by the roadside, and elderly tractors sitting in the mud, abandoned. You didn't find that 60 years ago. So, yes, mobile phones. Monks love mobile phones on the mountain. I find this very distressing. Yes, so the last 54 years have undoubtedly been, on the whole, a time of renewal, springtime in the garden of the Panagia, a time of progress and fresh hope. And what is the basic reason for this renewal? Briefly, you can mention a number of factors. The one that I see as the most significant is the presence on the Holy Mountain of elders, of gerontes and starzi, people capable of giving guidance and of helping others on the path of prayer. We have had, for example, Father Vasilios in the monasteries of Stavronikita and Iviron, Father Ephraim of Philotheu, who went to the Holy Mountain some years ago, who went to North America some years ago, and who has founded 16 monasteries in America. There were no monasteries at all in the Greek Archdiocese when he went first, some with the old calendarist Greeks. So that's a remarkable effort. Then at Simonon Petra, there's been Father Emilianos, at Grigoriou, Father George. These are the monasteries that led the revival. Young people went to the monasteries where they would find spiritual guides, elders. And some of the spiritual guides on the Holy Mountain are outside the main monasteries. Notably, for example, Father Paisios, who died in 1994 and who was glorified as a saint this year, a few weeks ago. So that I see as the basic reason for a renewal on Athos. What contribution are the monks making to the world? Hospitality, yes. I recall many years ago Father Gabriel, who had been abbot of Dionysiou, one of the most observant and strict monasteries for some 50 years, saying many monks see the visitors as an interruption of their monastic life, as a disturbance. I do not agree with this, he said. Hospitality is part of the monastic tradition. As for the income that we receive here in Dionysiou, he said, we divide it into 3 equal parts. 1/3 goes on the upkeep of the buildings. Byzantine buildings are often quite expensive to maintain. 1/3, he says, goes for the needs of the monks, and 1/3 to pay for the visitors and pilgrims. However, if the visitors get too numerous, it does result in a real disturbance of monastic stillness. Certainly, what the monasteries are granting to the outside world is spiritual guidance, not just to the monks on the mountain, but to the countless laity who come on pilgrimage to Athos, and many of the spiritual fathers will go out from Athos, for example, in the pre-Christmas fast and again in the Lenten fast, and go round Greece hearing confessions. Married priests, of course, and even laity, women as well as men, can act as spiritual guides. But the Athonite monks are doing this a great deal. But neither of these things, hospitality or spiritual guidance, seem to me to be the chief reason why we have monks. The primary task of the monk is prayer. Not just intercessory prayer, but prayer in itself, all prayer. And this has value in itself. Today, as in the past, the Holy Mountain is supporting the outside world by acting as a powerhouse of living prayer. Let me end with a story from an early monastic source, Palladius, the Lausiac history. He was in Egypt as a novice. He felt discouraged. He went to see his spiritual father, St. Macarius of Alexandria. And he said, "Abba, my thoughts tell me you are wasting your time here in the monastery. Go back into the world. What shall I tell my thoughts?" And Macarius said to him, "Say this to your thoughts: I am guarding the walls." We may think of the monks as sentries, watchmen on the walls of the spiritual city. And because of them, the inhabitants of the city within the walls are able to continue their lives in greater peace and security. Against whom do the monks guard the walls? The early monks and the Athonite monks today would have quite a clear answer there. Against the demons, against the forces of evil. How do the monks guard the walls? Through prayer. This is how monks help the world, whether Athonite or otherwise. Not actively, but existentially. Not primarily through preaching, teaching, and writing, through outward works of mercy, but through prayer of the heart. It is this that upholds the universe. Thank you.